For this episode of Themes and Variations, I'm here at this beautiful old Anglican church at the heart of downtown Eastside Vancouver, where music from 7th and 8th century onwards until modern day kind of fills the air at least once a week. I'm here with Gerald, who is an amazing organist and a great choral conductor and also the music director of this church. Thank you for being here, Gerald.
My pleasure.
So, for people who have not attended a high mass liturgy, they might still have heard the term mass setting, or they have heard the phrase Kyrie eleison and things like that. So what is a mass setting?
Well, a mass, there's several different ways of looking at that. Mass setting, you could be referring to a set of music that's been written, purposely written for Christian worship, that sets the ancient texts of the Mass. Texts that have existed, most of which have existed since the beginnings of the Church.
Right. And there are four major parts to a Mass setting, and that we at least sing from week to week, and there are other parts that we sing on special occasions. Yeah,
there are two separate parts to a Mass. There's the Mass Ordinary,
right,
and those are the parts of the Mass that do not change from one celebration of the Mass to another. The Kyrie, the Sanctus Benedictus, the Agnus Dei, and also interpolated within that the Gloria and the Credo. So those are the ordinary of the Mass, the fixed parts of the Mass.
Right.
And then the other major part of any Mass are the propers of the Mass.
Right.
And this is whether it's a said Mass or whether the Mass is sung musically.
Right.
And the other parts are the propers of the Mass. And so those are the texts that are unique to any given week,
right,
or any feast, any celebration of the Mass. And
for example, like at Easter time.
Yes, exactly. And so those are things like the Alleluia, the offertory chant, communion chant, during Lent, the tract, things like that. Those are the variable texts.
Right. So we have the Kyrie, that is the first thing from the Mass setting that we will hear in a high Mass liturgy.
Typically,
even though that
yes.
is not the first musical element of a high Mass liturgy, this is the first item from the Mass setting that we will hear.
Correct.
In the high Mass liturgy.
Yes.
But that text is in Greek as opposed to Latin, or which is the language for all the other parts of the Mass.
Yes, that is true. It's the only part of the Mass that is in Greek.
Is there a reason why we are retaining the Greek text?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask that. I really don't know, to be honest with you. It could be that it just reflects the language of the original language of the Christian Bible,
right,
the New Testament, as we call it,
right,
Christian section of the Bible.
Right.
Beyond that, I'm not sure why we've retained the Greek language for that. I mean, if you're going to look at the term that we're discussing here today, the term liturgy, that is also a Greek term, and so there's a strong connection between the Greek world, right, and Christianity,
right,
the religion that grew out of that world.
Right. If somebody's coming to attend a high Mass liturgy, which happens every Sunday, what is the first musical element that they would hear?
If it's not Lent, they will hear a voluntary played on the organ.
Right. And why is that term used, voluntary?
I have no idea.
Okay. So voluntary, in the sense, it's like a prelude to the service.
Yeah.
It's the function that it is kind of gathering the people so that they can come into like this contemplative mood. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's the idea. And I think I need to back up. I need to back up here and say when I said I have no idea, I actually do have an idea. And I don't know. I haven't really thought about the word a lot before, but it makes perfect sense to me now in the moment. That there's a voluntary played at the beginning,
right,
and there's a voluntary played at the end.
Right.
And I think it's probably fair to say that the word voluntary is there because those are not properly parts of the Mass. The Mass has not yet begun when the voluntary is played at the beginning.
Right.
And when the voluntary is played at the end, the Mass has ended. In fact, ita missa est, the priest has pronounced, the Mass has ended.
Right.
Then the organist plays a voluntary, and it's sort of it's an add-on. Mass has properly ended. This is sort of just a little bonus musical material at the end. But you're right in suggesting that I believe that the prelude at the beginning is to help everybody settle down, prepare hearts, and get ready for the Mass that is to come.
One of the things that always caught my attention with the Anglican hymnals, I don't know if any other hymnals have the same idea, that there are tunes that are named.
Yes.
And I always found it fascinating because you can use a different text and use a particular tune, and that tune has a name.
Right.
And that is a practice that just goes back to...
That's a practice that goes back centuries. And once again, the Protestant Reformation has a lot to do with this, because writing of hymns flourished after the Reformation.
Right.
Yeah, there were hymns written before the Reformation. They weren't typically in parts, and this relates to the course of music history in general, right? The way music started as monody, and then we developed from there. But hymn writing really started to flourish during and after the Protestant Reformation. And yes, because a hymn is not the music. Right. A hymn is the text that we sing. Right. And we sing it to a particular tune. And you're right, the tunes, many tunes can be used for other hymns. Right. And in fact, in the back of virtually any hymn book is a metrical index. Right. There's an index that shows that shows this meter, and this meter, and all the different tunes are listed with their names under those different meters. So if you're looking for a different tune for a particular hymn, you just go and look in that index. And it doesn't mean that every one of the tunes with the same meter will work because of word stress and so on, but very often they do. And the tunes, the names, there's no particular convention about naming hymns. People have named them for, their favorite niece, or the town they grew up in, or a town that they have great memories of. A lot of English tunes are named for towns. Right.
And the Protestant Reformation, you're referring to the tunes from that period, like Martin Luther himself has written many tunes that we are still singing that has been set to 4-part harmony later in his... I don't think there was 4-part harmony at the time when he was writing those hymns. They were sung as
He was writing tunes.
Right.
Yeah, he wasn't writing what later came to be known as chorales. And
you would say that it is probably since Bach's time that they all got like this 4-part treatment?
Yes, particularly. Yeah, I mean, there are settings from before Bach. People were starting to write in that style, but Bach really set the tone
and the sheer volume of his works.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And the rules that we observe of 4-part writing really are rules that we take from Bach.
Right. Yeah. So there are two types of Mass. There's the High Mass and then there's the Low Mass. I don't know if that is the correct phrase, but...
Low Mass is often what we use to describe a said Mass. Right. So Mass can be said, and Mass is said here at St. James every day. So we only have Mass with music, what we call High Mass or Solemn Mass. Mass with music on Sundays and important feast days. In a cathedral setting, they might very well have a Mass with music every day because they have the resources to do that. Right. If you want to talk about the word Mass, that simply comes from the last phrase that the priest utters in Latin at the end of the liturgy, ita missa est. The Mass is ended. Right. Yeah. and that's simply where the word came from. I have no idea why over the centuries we happen to have glommed onto that particular word.
Right.
Maybe some people were excited that Mass was over, and so that's the word they remembered.
Well,
I say that tongue in cheek, but
it could also mean that it is a gathering of people and like a mass.
It could,
people.
but that's not really the derivation of the term.
Right.
Yeah.
The difference between a high mass and a low mass is the fact that several parts of the mass is sung either by the choir or if the celebrant, that is the word used for the priest. If the celebrant is singing if celebrant were to sing Kyrie or Gloria and things like that, would that still be considered a high mass? Or does it need to be like with all the choir and...
Yes, certainly we can have a Mass without a choir, and it can, but it would typically it's sung. Everything is sung, aside from the readings
right.
and prayers. In our context, anyway, although there are some contexts in which everything can be sung.
Right.
It's possible to do a Mass where every word is sung from the beginning to the end. But typically, a Mass is either said or sung.
Right.
Now, a sung Mass becomes a high Mass or solemn Mass with the inclusion of a designated deacon,
right.
The use of incense. Those are all part of when you use the term solemn Mass,
right.
It assumes that you have those elements
right. included
as well.
Is the solemn Mass the same as the Trident Mass? Is that the term used interchangeably?
It has elements of it, but it's not. The Tridentine Mass is really a Roman Catholic rite.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we are talking about the Mass, there's a specific order, and then we started talking about the first musical element of that musical, the order, and which is the organ playing. But then you were saying that it is called voluntary probably because it is before the Mass is actually starting. But the first actual musical element of the Mass probably then is the entrance hymn or the introit.
Correct.
Are they the same thing, introit and the entrance hymn, or?
They are. Historically, the first element there would have been the introit, properly called the introit,
right.
and it would have been chanted.
Right.
In our thinking, and this is something that's particular. Different parish congregations handle this differently. At one time, we chanted an introit here.
Right.
So right after the organ voluntary, and it's called an introit. It's an entrance.
Right.
Right. So as the priests and servers are coming into the church, the choir covers their movement
right.
with an introit. The thinking here in this church has evolved in more recent years to the idea that it might be good to involve the congregation in that entrance. And so we sing instead an entrance hymn that allows the congregation to get on their feet, get the blood flowing, right. and become involved. Because and one thing that I haven't mentioned so far is the word liturgy itself has connotations of the involvement of the congregation
right.
and of people,
right.
of the body that's assembled, doing stuff.
Right. So it is
right.
not the priest performing things and then the people are watching. It is not that idea. It is everybody's participating.
Exactly. One of the definitions of the word liturgy is work of the people.
I see.
And so it has to, at various points, involve everybody.
Right.
And so coming back to the entrance hymn / introit, it's actually our more recent rector who sensed that people needed to be
right.
involved right from
right.
the get-go.
Right. The hymns are four-part settings that the choir and the congregation will sing together, and the organ will play the melody first, in 4 parts so that the congregation can, if they don't know how to read music, they will understand the tune. It's usually a simple, beautiful tune. And then the choir will be singing all the other parts as well when it's happening. But introit is a chant. It's would you say that that body of work is coming from the Gregorian chant, from that body of works?
Yes, definitely.
Right.
Yeah, and we have a real treasure of all of the propers of the Mass, of which the introit is the first,
right.
That come to us from over 1,000 years ago.
Right.
The Gregorian chant dates from the 9th or 10th century, and it's called Gregorian chant because we tend to ascribe it to Pope Gregory.
Right.
But it's doubtful that he actually wrote those chants. But it was a convenient way to label them. So they're very old. Over the centuries, the chant tradition was lost somewhat. So into the Middle Ages, and then through the Renaissance and during the time of the Protestant Reformation, really chant became, might almost say that chant became corrupted. Because things were written down, but in a very rudimentary sort of way, and people didn't understand them, or they didn't have access. Of course, there's no printing presses before Gutenberg, and so they didn't have access to scores, and so people went by what they remembered, and then things, over the centuries, so it's not surprising. The monks of Solesmes really in the 19th century did an amazing amount of research and scholarly work on what manuscripts there are, and really sort of pulled it all together so that thanks to them largely, and other scholars as well over the years, we now have collections of chant that in previous centuries people wouldn't have had access to.
And also the evolution of music notation probably also helped with preserving a lot of these kind of musical materials. Right. But we still use the old school notation at this church.
We do.
As we call it with a nickname called the square notes.
Square notes, round notes, yes. The round notes being, it's interesting that the gradual that we use, and the gradual is just simply the name for a collection of propers. The definitive collection is the Roman gradual, which was published by the Solesmes monks. It uses square notation. Our gradual that we use on a weekly basis for the solemn chants, which are the more complex chants, has round notation. And it was put together by an American editor 20 or 25 years ago for use by modern congregations. His thinking being they would be able to access it more easily. And interestingly enough, he has now come out, or is in the process of coming out with a square note, so a Neum notation version of the same gradual. So it's kind of come full circle. He's coming back and saying, I don't know if it's his own thinking or people asking for it. Because as we, I think, both can agree, you sing chant differently from the original notation, the Neum notation than you do from modern notation. It gets your mind in a different space.
And also the word underlays are very interesting, but that also has to do with the translation too.
It does, because ideally we would sing all of the propers in Latin.
Introit changes from Sunday to Sunday based on the theme of the Sunday.
There's a unique one for every single week and every single feast day of the church year.
And for example, the chant Puer natus est is the introit for the Christmas Mass. So it's a beautiful tune, and there are several of them that are specific to each Sunday. So after the introit and the entrance hymn is sung, the next musical element, in my experience, is the Kyrie from the Mass setting that we mentioned at first in this conversation. So Kyrie is 3 different phrases: Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, the repetition. And has it been like that for, like, when do we see this kind of, this practice?
Kyrie eleison, I believe, comes from the very earliest days of the church, like within the first several centuries
Right.
of the existence of the Christian church.
Right, and until the solemn mass was established, it was said by the priest, or everybody?
That's a good question. Very often it would have been said or sung by the priest or sung by a choir of men, and it would have been only men at that point, and the gathered congregation would listen.
Right.
But singing it, just to make another point here about this, singing it happened fairly early on, the idea of singing these elements of the Mass. And obviously it's beautiful. Singing is more beautiful to us, especially as musicians, than simply speaking.
Right.
And there's an emotive element
Right.
involved in singing. But in practical terms, there were no amplification systems back then.
Right.
In practical terms, it's thought that singing also came about because it could be heard more clearly.
Right.
You could project
Right.
that singing voice
Right.
out into the room, into the building,
Right.
to be heard more easily than
Right.
you could just simply speaking it.
Right. So one could also make an argument that the construction of the churches and the people who treated the acoustics inside the churches were very keenly aware of these kind of nuances and how sound carries inside the church. For example, it's a beautiful space here to sing. And I think that will be the case with most of the churches where singing is at the heart of the liturgy.
Right. Well, I mean, the early Christian church inherited Roman buildings.
Right.
Roman buildings that might have been used for the worship of pre-Christian gods,
Right.
or they were public buildings.
Right.
Period. So the infrastructure was kind of in place already, and they adapted to
be filled with
what
good
was
music.
there. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so after the Kyrie comes Gloria, the next musical element in the Mass is Gloria, and Gloria, the text is, it's glory to God on high.
Yeah.
And that sometimes is sung as a chant, sometimes is sung as a four-part setting, sometimes is it spoken?
It's said in a low Mass, yeah.
Right. And the next is the reading, and then before the reading, what do we have?
So there's a collect,
Right.
and that's a prayer, and it's a collect because it's a prayer that gathers everybody. It gathers our thoughts regarding the day.
Right.
It really very often summarizes the theme of the day and collects us and collects those
Right.
themes together
Right.
for the day.
Right. And that will lead to the first reading.
Yes.
Right. And the first reading is the reading from any of the Gospels.
The first reading is from the Old Testament.
From the Old Testament.
Except during Easter season, in which we are now, where very often it's a reading from the Acts of the Apostles, which is a story of the early church
Right.
After Jesus' resurrection and ascension.
Right.
So Jesus is gone, church people are left, and it's kind of the story of how they all dealt with that.
Right. Right. And that is the season we are in right
That's
now.
the season that we're in right now. But typically it would be an Old Testament reading or a reading from the Hebrew Bible, as
Right.
it's more properly known.
Right. And then comes the Psalms.
Yes.
And Psalms is something that has a long history.
Right.
It also comes from the Old Testament period.
Yes.
Right.
So the Psalms are the hymns of the Jewish people.
Right. And the original were in Hebrew.
Yes.
Right. I've heard psalms sung in different kinds of ways. So we have the American Psalter, from which we sometimes sing, and so it's very interesting in that there's a psalm tone, and then there's a antiphon to the psalm. So it has several components to it that kind of makes it its own interesting kind of act, if I can use that term. So the antiphon is something that is related to this particular Sunday.
Yes. So in the Psalter that you're talking about, I mean, so there are 8 psalm tones, and so each of the 150 psalms in the Psalter draws on one of those tones for the chanting of the verses. In the particular Psalter that we use, the editor has come up with the antiphons.
Right.
And the antiphons typically pull text from the psalm itself.
Right.
There may be a half of a verse here and a half of a verse there, and they're put together, and it somehow makes sense.
Right.
And he has also, somewhat cleverly, provided antiphons to be sung on any given, a regular Sunday or weekday, and then a bunch of antiphons for Easter season or for Lent or for the Christmas season.
The Psalter, just to clarify, Psalter is a book that is a collection of all the psalms, and if there are no tunes to that psalms, would that still be considered a Psalter?
Yes.
Okay, so Psalter is just a collection of all the psalms. And,
yes.
In what we are referring to is it contains all the psalm verses and also tunes.
Right.
Right. So usually the way we are doing it here, we have the cantor who will sing the psalm, and then the choir repeats it, and then the cantor is by themselves singing each of the verse, and then the choir repeats the antiphon. So that is how that meaning the word kind of makes sense in that context.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you have not heard any of the psalm verses, there are so many psalm verses, especially one that has been made famous by many goth rock bands. As I walk through the valley of death, like I will fear no evil. That is a psalm verse.
Yes.
And
yeah, so that's from Psalm 23. I thought you were going to be referencing "By the Waters of Babylon."
Oh my God!
The famous Boney-M psalm setting.
That is true.
We've never done that one here.
Right. That is true.
That's also a psalm.
Right. Right. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down.
Yes. And that's a psalm of lament. It's from the time when the nation, the Jewish people, had been basically abducted or kicked out of their land by the Persian king, and they were exiled.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the next musical item is Alleluia, conditions apply. Right?
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, the reading after the psalm is the what we call the epistle reading. So it's from the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, but not the Gospels. So the first 4 books of the New Testament are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, followed by the epistles or letters. So these are letters written by Paul, many of them by Paul, but by other apostles. Right. And that's the reading that takes place at that point.
Right.
Then between that reading and the gospel reading, which is the paramount reading of the day, we sing an Alleluia, unless it is Lent. And in Lent we sing a tract, because we don't use the A word during Lent.
Right.
That's reserved for the rest of the year.
It is because the general tone of the church is in mourning, kind of.
Yes, I mean we're in a penitential season, and the word Alleluia is such a word of rejoicing, of praise, so much so. So there's a kind of balance that takes place. So we abolish Alleluia during Lent, but then as soon as Easter happens and we enter the Easter season, we amplify Alleluias. Right. There are more Alleluias than there ever were before. Right. So we have double Alleluias. Right. At the dismissal to Mass, we have an extended Alleluia, more Alleluias. Right. There's another part of the propers that historically took place during this transition from the epistle reading to the gospel reading, and that was the sequence.
Right.
And we see very few of those anymore. In fact, there are only 6 left, I believe, for major feast days. But it's an interesting thing in which an Alleluia was sung and then as a singer would embellish or improvise on the last syllable, Alleluia, the ah vowel, and people over the years developed texts to fit the underlay of those embellishments, and those became sequences. So we still sing a sequence here at Easter. We have a hymn actually in our hymn book that is a sequence hymn. Christians to the Paschal Victim. That is one of the ancient sequences.
That is for the Easter season.
Yes, that's specifically it's for the Feast of Easter. It's for Easter. It's for Easter Day, really. Yeah, but there are others. The others that remain. There's one for Pentecost. There's one for Corpus Christi. So there's about a half a dozen that still remain that are officially still, hymns. So that's what happens. But typically here, what happens is we sing an Alleluia with a verse that often alludes to the gospel that is to follow immediately.
Right. And is gradual something that happens is it a replacement for tract and Alleluia, or is it something that...
So the gradual was also sung between readings, typically between the first and second reading. It's not, we don't chant it here.
Right.
And the term simply comes from the Latin word gradus, which is a step.
Steps, right.
Yeah. And so the deacon would get on the step and chant.
Right.
And that's where the term comes from.
There's also that famous counterpoint book by Fuchs, Gradus ad Parnassium.
Right. Indeed.
Climbing the mountain.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. After the Alleluia, and then the next musical item is the chant during the offertory chant, right?
Right. Yes. So, Alleluia, gospel, typically a homily here.
Right.
Creed is the next musical thing.
Right. Creed is the next musical item, but because it is such a big text, and because the service has to be, for the time purposes and practicality, to keep it short, we generally speak or chant the creed in a plain chant setting, or...
We do, and we have two settings here that we typically use, and those are, I've restricted it to two over the years, because I subscribe to the view that the creed is properly the property of the people. Right? We sometimes, so backing things up to the Gloria, we also do that for the Gloria. We have two settings of the Gloria, and most often it is sung, chanted by choir and congregation for the same reason, but we do sometimes the choir does sometimes sing a choral setting of the Gloria. But the creed itself, because it's a statement of faith, I believe that the people need to be able to say or sing it themselves. So, but you're right, we do. It's a long text, and any choral setting of it is going to really extend. So the next thing, as you were suggesting earlier, the next thing is after the creed and then the prayers, and typically here a confession is the offertory chant.
Well, is it tied to the confession, the offertory chant? Right. It comes after.
Yeah.
Right. And offertory chant is again called a proper because it is specific to a Sunday.
It is.
And it is often chanted. We do not really use any four-part setting of offertory text, do we?
No.
Right. Do such things exist?
I imagine they do. Because I know that William Byrd, for example, wrote collections of propers in 4 parts,
Right.
4 or 5 parts, as the case may be. So I imagine that he wrote settings of the offertory as well, but we never do that here.
Right.
And I think that's partly because it's immediately followed here by an offertory hymn.
Right. Which is then followed by the motet.
Musically by the Sanctus.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Of course, I forgot that.
Yeah.
Motet comes after all of that.
Yeah.
So offertory, and then there's the offertory hymn, and offertory is mostly sung by the choir, and in the offertory hymn, the congregation participate. It's done in the same style as the entrance hymn, where the organ will play the tune first, and then people will come in and it is sung. And the other musical elements that to follow are, again, parts of the Mass setting. So there's Sanctus and Agnus Dei that will follow before anything else at this point.
Right. I mean, intervening is the priest's prayer of great thanksgiving,
right.
Which is started by the Sursum Corda, which is also a gathering of us into this prayer, of everybody into this prayer. Right. But yes, that's then the proper preface. So within that prayer, the Great Thanksgiving, is a preface that's specific to the day,
right.
And then the Sanctus is either said if it's a low mass, or in the case of high mass or solemn mass here, is sung, and typically by the choir when it's in the choir season.
Right.
Yeah.
So we do sing 4-part settings of that by great Renaissance composers like Palestrina, Victoria, Bird, Lazo, and all those people. And we also sing very much modern music at the church. So which is something that I really appreciate about singing at this space. It's quite educational just from that point of view itself.
Once again, these are texts that have inspired many composers to write settings.
Right, and that is the interesting thing, right? It is the same text, and there's so many settings of this text from various composers and from the same composer themselves. There are so many different types of settings of the same text.
Yes, and indeed.
It's just amazing. And so Sanctus is essentially you're saying holy, holy, holy. And that is the text. That is the emotion of the text.
Yeah, the text is scriptural.
Right.
The Gloria in Excelsis is a scriptural text. Right. Holy, holy, holy references a passage in Isaiah, I believe, in which there's a vision of God in the temple, and there's a picture of clouds of incense, and there are cherubim and seraphim, and this is what they're chanting, and so they in the presence of God are saying these words, and now we have appropriated these words. We take these words and we sing them.
Right. And at the time of when the Sanctus is being sung, before that the bells are ringing, and then the incenses and everything will be kind of going up, and it's quite the ambience, if I may use that term.
Yes, indeed.
And Benedictus is usually like a more of a personal kind of, I wouldn't say personal, but like it's an intimate setting that, from my experience, compared to Sanctus.
Right. It is indeed. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and it's it's interesting that typically in musical settings the Benedictus dynamically backs away from what the Sanctus was. Yeah.
And it goes back up again with the re-entry of the Hosanna.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment on something a point that you just raised before we talked about this, and that was you talked about ambiance, and it's a side note, but this is a hallmark of what we do here as high church Anglicans, as Anglo-Catholics, is we attempt to engage all of the senses in the course of the ritual here, right? So there are sights. Right. There's the movement at the front of the church. There are the intricate vestments that that the clergy and servers are wearing. There's the smells of incense going up. There's the sounds of music, of bells, everything. So it's really a way of it's a kind of a whole body experience in a way.
It's a transcendental experience. Like,
Yeah.
And so after the Benedictus, then again is the text Agnus Dei. But again, I think that if people have not participated in a high liturgy, they still have heard these terms because it's so used in so many places these days, and especially during Christmas seasons, you'll hear a popular choir singing these texts.
Yeah, exactly. And
So-
once again, a scriptural text, Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world, is roughly a quote of John the Baptist when he meets Jesus. That's how he presents Jesus to the gathered crowd.
Right.
Here comes the Lamb of God who's come to take away the sin of the world, and we sing that.
Right. And that text has a part that changes. During the first iteration, we will sing Dona nobis pacem, and then
Have mercy on us.
and then the second one is the Dona nobis pacem,
Right.
grant us peace.
Right.
Right. And after that, the consecration of the Eucharist has happened. By that time, the consecration of Eucharist has happened. People have received the communion, and then we are moving to the motet for the day.
Right.
And the motet can be considered proper in that the text changes from Sunday to Sunday, but it's not really considered a.
So in the Latin Mass, there is a communion antiphon that is sung at that point.
Right.
And in my mind, the motet that the choir sings kind of stands in the place of that.
I see. That's
They're
interesting.
going to ring the bell
Yeah.
right about now. So that in itself is an ancient practice, ringing the bells for the Angelus at noon.
Right.
And the bell was rung in a pattern that allows people to then recite the Angelus. So there were sections to the ringing.
Right.
To recite the Angelus, the same Angelus that we sing at the end of Mass.
Right.
Typically, except for during the Easter season, we sing Regina Coeli. I mean, we're jumping ahead here to the end, but there are 4 seasonal Marian antiphons. So 4 different hymns, if you will, that honor the Virgin Mary, and they are associated with the different seasons of the church year. Right. And the one that we're singing right now, because we are on Eastertide, is Regina Coeli, and it is very much about Easter and the resurrection, but still, but honoring Mary and talking about her role in bringing that about.
Right, and the phrase itself means Queen of Heaven.
Yes.
Right. And the final hymn, again, is also picked for the theme of the day, and so it is still a part of the whole Mass experience, or the Mass liturgy.
It is. I mean, I choose the hymns, and it's always my intent to tie them in with the theme of the day, with the readings for the day, and so on. Right. Having said that, I mean, the final hymn, at least where it's placed here, you could say it's extraneous, because once again, ita missa est, the Mass has ended. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. Are the words said or sung right before that? So Mass is done. Everything that happens after that is kind of a bonus. Right.
So it's a voluntary, non-voluntary kind of thing.
Exactly. Yes. But back to your point, yes, it's still, the intent still with the final hymn is to tie in to the theme of the day. But it's also, so there are various other things that go into choosing the hymns. So for the offertory, the hymn, one of the considerations is it needs to be long enough for the priest to prepare for communion at the altar. The closing hymn, I like it to be not too long, but familiar enough so that people can feel good about what they just sang, because they knew it and they could sing it, and somewhat joyful. So we wouldn't sing a contemplative hymn at the very end. And then the very first hymn, the entrance hymn, the intent, whenever possible, is to have it really, really set the mood for the day, or kind of get into the theme of the day. That's the intent. It doesn't always work that way because we go through a lot of hymns and we have a big repertoire of hymns, but that's the idea.
And then it's the voluntary at the end, or postlude.
Right.
And that is an organ piece, which is kind of...
It's usually a big piece, a big sort of celebratory piece of music. My rule of thumb is keep it under 5 minutes. I'm not going to ask people to sit for 10 minutes and listen to a full Bach prelude and fugue. And a point that I might want to raise about that is that we don't have these during Lent. So one of the long-standing practices of the Church is to not have the organ used for anything but supporting singing during the season of Lent. And that's just another way of sort of setting aside the season of Lent and marking it. Because we don't have flowers on the altar either. We don't sing Alleluia. We don't sing the Gloria in Excelsis. So it's another way of differentiating the season, with the exception of the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is Gaudete Sunday, so named for the first word of the introit for the day in Latin, rejoice. So it's kind of the seventh inning stretch of of Lent is where we have a bit of okay, we can relax. We don't have to be quite as penitential today, so we relax the rules around around having voluntaries. That sort of.
So thank you for kind of walking us through all of this, and I hope to kind of collect more information regarding the Anglican liturgy and the music used in the Anglican liturgy. It's quite big.
I think we've just kind of scratched the surface here today.
But that is for another time. And so thank you. It's
my
nice
pleasure.
talking to you.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to go on about this.